They handed me the envelope at the estate attorney's office. What they didn't know was that for 8 months, I'd believed I wasn't supposed to be in that room at all. I sat between Nathaniel's parents, Catherine and Robert Ashford, while the lawyer explained beneficiary designations and trust structures, and I kept waiting for someone to ask why I was there. Nathaniel sat across the mahogany table, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him like they might catch fire if he looked away. 20 minutes earlier, he'd tried to convince me to wait in the car. He'd said estate planning was family business, that I'd be bored, that we could grab lunch after, and he'd explain everything I needed to know. But Catherine had insisted I come inside, and now I understood why. The inheritance I'd been told I was losing had never been taken away because Nathaniel had made the whole thing up. Every cruel conversation, every accusation about my behavior embarrassing his family, every threat that his parents were rewriting their will to exclude me, all of it had been lies designed to keep me afraid and compliant. And his parents had no idea he'd been saying any of it. It started the night of Catherine's 70th birthday party, a formal dinner at their estate in Greenwich that Nathaniel had insisted we attend despite my exhaustion from working double shifts at the hospital. I was a cardiac nurse at Yale New Haven, and that particular week had destroyed me. We'd lost 2 patients in 3 days, both younger than 50, both preventable if they'd had better access to care. I'd come home crying twice, and Nathaniel had seemed understanding, making tea and listening while I processed the grief. But when the birthday party came, he'd expected me to perform, smile graciously, make conversation with his parents' country club friends, laugh at jokes I didn't find funny, and navigate the unspoken social rules of a world I hadn't grown up in. I'd tried. I really had. But at some point during cocktail hour, exhausted and emotionally depleted, I'd excused myself from a conversation with one of Robert's golf partners and sat alone on the terrace for 15 minutes, just breathing. The drive home that night was silent until we hit the Merritt Parkway. Then Nathaniel started. He told me I'd embarrassed him, that disappearing during the party made me look antisocial, that his mother had noticed and commented. I apologized, explained I just needed a moment to decompress, that grief from work was still sitting heavy in my chest. He said that was exactly the problem. He said I brought my work stress into every family event, that I couldn't separate my professional life from my personal obligations, that his parents had built their wealth through discipline and grace under pressure, and I was showing them I didn't have those qualities. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He told me his parents were concerned about our marriage, specifically about whether I understood what it meant to be part of their family. He said they'd been discussing their estate planning recently, and my behavior was making them reconsider how much of the inheritance should be protected from my influence. I asked what that meant. He said it meant they were thinking about setting up trusts that excluded me entirely, that ensured whatever he inherited would never become marital property, that if we divorced, I'd leave with nothing of the Ashford legacy. He said this like it was reasonable, like my moment of solitude on a terrace had somehow justified cutting me out of their family's financial future. I was 32 years old and making $68,000 a year saving lives in a cardiac unit. Nathaniel worked in finance, something involving hedge funds and international markets that I'd never fully understood despite his attempts to explain it. His income was 8 times mine. We lived in a house his parents had helped us buy, in a neighborhood where my nursing salary wouldn't have covered rent on a studio apartment. The inheritance he was talking about wasn't just money. It was generational wealth, the kind that meant security, opportunity, the ability to make choices without financial fear. The idea that I could lose access to it because I'd needed 15 minutes alone at a party felt insane, but Nathaniel presented it as a natural consequence of my failure to meet expectations. I apologized again that night, promised I'd do better, and hated myself for how small my voice sounded. Over the next 8 months, the inheritance became his weapon. Every time I disappointed him, every time I failed to perform the version of myself he wanted, he'd remind me that his parents were watching and making decisions about my worthiness. When I couldn't attend a charity gala because I'd picked up an emergency shift to cover for a colleague whose daughter was hospitalized, Nathaniel told me Catherine had mentioned my absence and seemed hurt. He said they were meeting with their estate attorney the following week, and these things added up. When I wore a dress to Robert's retirement dinner that Nathaniel deemed too casual, he said I'd looked underdressed compared to the other wives, and his mother had definitely noticed. He said the trust revisions were getting more specific, that they were working with lawyers to ensure I'd have no claim to Ashford family assets. When I suggested we spend Thanksgiving with my family in Ohio instead of his parents in Connecticut, he said that kind of attitude was exactly why his parents questioned my commitment to their family. He said the estate planning was nearly finalized, and if I wanted any chance of being included, I needed to prove I understood priorities. I started changing everything about myself to meet standards that kept shifting. I stopped picking up extra shifts even when my unit was short-staffed because Nathaniel said my availability for family events mattered more than my career ambitions. I bought expensive clothes I couldn't afford because he said Catherine noticed these things and made judgments about who belonged in their social circle. I smiled through dinners where Robert's friends made casually racist comments about their housekeepers because Nathaniel said challenging them would make me look aggressive and politically extreme. I attended charity luncheons I found soul-crushingly superficial because Nathaniel said Catherine expected me there and was keeping track of my participation. I became quieter, smaller, more agreeable, more apologetic. I stopped talking about my patients or my work because Nathaniel said it made his parents uncomfortable to hear about suffering during meals. I stopped expressing opinions that differed from the Ashford family consensus because Nathaniel said independent thinking was fine in theory but looked like defiance in practice. Every version of myself I sacrificed was justified by the fear that I'd lose everything if I didn't comply. The inheritance became the measurement of my worth, and Nathaniel was the only one who could tell me if I was measuring up. But I never heard any of this directly from Catherine or Robert. Every update about their disappointment, every detail about trust revisions, every warning about estate planning decisions came through Nathaniel. When I saw his parents at family dinners, they seemed warm, asked about my work, remembered details I'd shared about my patients. Catherine hugged me when we arrived and when we left. Robert always made a point of thanking me for taking care of their son, for working such demanding hours to help people. They never seemed cold or judgmental or concerned about my worthiness. But Nathaniel explained that was just good manners, but old money families didn't confront people directly, that their real opinions came out in private conversations with their children and their lawyers. I believed him because I'd grown up middle class in Toledo, and what did I know about how wealthy families actually operated? Maybe this was normal. Maybe I just didn't understand the codes. The estate planning meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday in March. Nathaniel had mentioned it casually over breakfast, said his parents wanted to finalize some documents, and their attorney needed all relevant parties present. I assumed relevant parties meant Nathaniel and his younger sister, Vivian, who lived in Boston and worked in architecture. I didn't think I'd be included given everything Nathaniel had told me about the trust revisions specifically designed to exclude me. But that Monday night, Catherine called my cell phone directly, not Nathaniel's, which was unusual. She asked if I'd received the meeting details for tomorrow, said the attorney had sent them to both of us, but she wanted to confirm I'd be there. I was confused. I told her I thought the meeting was just for family. There was a pause, and then Catherine's voice changed, became concerned in a way I'd never heard before. She asked why I'd think I wasn't family, if Nathaniel had said something to make me feel excluded. I panicked, worried I'd revealed something Nathaniel had told me in confidence, worried I'd created exactly the kind of awkward situation he'd warned me about. I backtracked, said I'd just assumed estate planning was for blood relatives, that I didn't want to intrude. Catherine was quiet for a moment, then told me firmly that I was absolutely expected at the meeting, that the estate planning specifically included provisions for me, and that she'd be offended if I didn't attend. She said she'd see me tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the attorney's office in Stamford, and that we could have tea afterward if I had time. I said I'd be there, my mind racing to understand what this meant. That night, I told Nathaniel about the call. I expected him to be pleased that his mother had invited me, maybe relieved that despite my failures, I was still being included. Instead, he got angry. He said I'd misunderstood Catherine's intention, that she was just being polite because she'd called and I'd answered, that the actual meeting would be family only, and I'd be asked to wait in the reception area. I told him Catherine had specifically said the estate planning included provisions for me. Nathaniel's face darkened. He said I was twisting her words, reading into things I didn't understand, that I was setting myself up for embarrassment if I actually tried to participate in the meeting. He said I could come to the attorney's office if I insisted, but I needed to understand that when they asked me to leave the room during the actual estate discussion, I couldn't make a scene. He said this was exactly the kind of boundary-crossing behavior that made his parents question my judgment. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Nathaniel in our bed and tried to reconcile Catherine's warm invitation with his hostile warnings, and nothing made sense. The attorney's office was in a restored Victorian building in downtown Stamford, the kind of place where even the receptionist seemed to have a trust fund. Catherine and Robert were already there when I arrived, sitting in a waiting area with leather chairs and oil paintings of stern-looking men from previous centuries. Catherine stood up immediately when she saw me, hugged me, asked about my drive and whether I'd had lunch. Robert shook my hand and thanked me for taking time from work to be there. Nathaniel arrived 10 minutes later with Vivian, who'd driven down from Boston that morning. He looked surprised to see me sitting with his parents instead of waiting in the car like he'd suggested. The attorney, a distinguished woman in her 60s named Margaret Cho, invited us all into a conference room with windows overlooking the street. She directed us to seats around the table, placing me between Catherine and Robert. Nathaniel sat across from me. Margaret began explaining the purpose of the meeting, walking through documents that outlined the Ashford family trust structure, real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and beneficiary designations. Then she handed me an envelope. She said it contained my personal copy of the trust documents, specifically the sections relevant to my designation as a beneficiary. I looked at Nathaniel. His face was white. I looked at Catherine, confused. She smiled and squeezed my hand, said they'd wanted to make sure I understood exactly what provisions they'd made for me, that family took care of family, and I'd been family since the day Nathaniel and I married. Margaret continued, explaining that the trust included specific allocations for spouses of Ashford children, that these provisions were irrevocable and separate from marital assets, designed to ensure financial security regardless of what happened in individual marriages. She said Catherine and Robert had been very clear in their instructions that I was to be included with the same standing as Vivian's husband Derek, that there were no exclusions or conditional clauses, that my portion of the trust was mine by virtue of being Nathaniel's wife. I opened the envelope. The documents showed exact figures, percentages, property allocations. I was listed by name in multiple sections. There was nothing conditional about any of it. I asked if these provisions had always been in place or if they'd been recently added. Margaret checked her notes and said the original trust had been established when Nathaniel and I got engaged, and the only revisions made in the past 8 months had been to increase the allocation amounts for all beneficiaries, including me. She said Catherine and Robert had been very generous in their recent updates, wanting to ensure everyone was well provided for. Catherine was looking at me strangely now, her smile fading. She asked if something was wrong, if I'd had concerns about the estate planning. I didn't know what to say. Nathaniel made a sound, something between a cough and a protest, and started to speak, but Robert cut him off. Robert asked me directly if there was something we needed to discuss. I looked at Nathaniel. He was staring at the table, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. I looked back at Robert and Catherine, these people who'd apparently never questioned my worth, never threatened to exclude me, never said any of the things their son had claimed for 8 months. I told them the truth. I said Nathaniel had been telling me since last July that they were disappointed in my behavior, that they were revising the trust to exclude me, that I needed to prove myself worthy of being included in the Ashford family. The silence that followed felt like falling. Catherine's face went through several emotions at once. Confusion giving way to understanding, giving way to something cold and furious. Robert's expression didn't change except for his eyes, which fixed on his son with an intensity that made me glad I wasn't the target. Vivian looked between her brother and parents like she was watching something break in slow motion. Margaret Cho closed her folder quietly and said she'd give us privacy, stepping out of the conference room and closing the door behind her. Catherine asked Nathaniel if what I'd said was true. Her voice was calm, controlled, the kind of calm that's more frightening than yelling. Nathaniel tried to laugh it off. He said I'd misunderstood some conversations, that he'd been trying to encourage me to make better impressions at family events, that I was being dramatic about his word choices. Robert asked him a direct question. He asked if Nathaniel had told me they were disappointed in my behavior. Nathaniel hesitated, then admitted he'd expressed some concerns about my availability for family obligations. Catherine asked if he'd told me they were excluding me from the trust. Nathaniel said he'd mentioned they were considering revisions. Robert's voice dropped an octave. He asked his son to clarify exactly what revisions Nathaniel had told me they were considering. The truth came out in pieces, each admission worse than the last. Nathaniel had told me his parents found me embarrassing. They'd never said that. He'd told me they questioned whether I understood what it meant to be part of their family. They'd never expressed that. He'd told me they were setting up trusts specifically designed to exclude me from inheritance. No such trusts existed or had ever been discussed. He'd told me my behavior at family events was being monitored and judged as criteria for my inclusion in estate planning. His parents had never connected those things or evaluated me that way. Every threatening conversation, every warning about worthiness, every detail about trust revisions had been fabricated. Catherine asked why. Her voice was shaking now. She asked her son why he would lie about something like this, why he would tell his wife that her own in-laws were rejecting her when nothing could be further from the truth. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was defensive, resentful. He said I'd been difficult lately, too focused on work, not prioritizing family the way a wife should. He said he'd needed me to understand that there were consequences for not meeting expectations, that the inheritance was leveraged to encourage better behavior. Robert stood up. He told Nathaniel to leave the room. Nathaniel tried to argue, said we should discuss this as a family, that I was making too big a deal out of some miscommunications. Robert's voice went cold in a way I'd never heard, the kind of authority that comes from running a multinational corporation for 40 years. He told his son to leave the conference room immediately and wait in the reception area, and that they would be having a very different conversation than the one planned for today. Nathaniel left, his face red, his hands balled into fists. When the door closed behind him, Catherine turned to me with tears in her eyes. She apologized. She said if she'd known what Nathaniel was telling me, she would have corrected it immediately, that she was horrified her son had used their name to manipulate and control me. She said I'd always been welcome in their family, that they'd never once questioned my worth or my belonging, that the idea of excluding me from anything had never crossed their minds. Robert said something that made me start crying. He said they'd noticed I'd seemed more withdrawn lately, quieter at family events, almost nervous, and they'd worried I was unhappy or uncomfortable, but hadn't wanted to pry. He said now he understood I'd been walking on eggshells because their son had convinced me I was being evaluated for worthiness. He said that wasn't who they were, wasn't how they treated family, and he was sorry Nathaniel had made me feel that way. We sat in that conference room for another hour. Catherine asked me specific questions about what Nathaniel had said, when the lying had started, how it had escalated. I told her everything. The birthday party trigger, the constant warnings, the way every aspect of my behavior had become connected to inheritance threats, the person I'd become trying to meet impossible standards. Vivian cried when I described stopping my emergency shifts because Nathaniel said Catherine was tracking my availability. She said their mother had never once complained about my work schedule, had actually bragged to her friends about having a daughter-in-law who saved lives for a living. Robert asked if Nathaniel had benefited financially from making me believe I was excluded from the trust. I didn't understand the question until he clarified. He asked if Nathaniel had been positioning himself as my only financial security, making me dependent on his income and his goodwill because I believed his family had rejected me. I realized that was exactly what had happened. By making me think I'd lose everything if we divorced, Nathaniel had trapped me in a marriage where I had no power, no voice, no ability to leave even if I wanted to. The inheritance lie had been about control, about keeping me afraid and submissive, about ensuring I'd accept whatever treatment he decided I deserved. Catherine asked what I needed from them. I told her the truth was enough, that knowing they'd never rejected me, that seeing the actual trust documents, that understanding I hadn't been wrong to feel confused by the disconnect between their warmth and Nathaniel's warnings, all of that was more valuable than any inheritance amount. But Robert said there would be consequences for Nathaniel beyond just family disappointment. He said what Nathaniel had done was emotional abuse, using their name and reputation as weapons, and that was unforgivable. He said they'd be speaking with their attorney about revisions to the trust after all, but not the kind Nathaniel had invented. He said they'd be examining whether someone who'd manipulate his wife so cruelly should have unrestricted access to family wealth, whether additional oversight was needed, whether Nathaniel's portion should come with conditions about treatment of family members. Catherine added that Nathaniel would not be managing any aspect of their estate or business interests going forward, roles he'd assumed he'd inherit along with the money. She said trust was earned, and her son had proven he couldn't be trusted with power over other people's security. I filed for divorce 3 weeks later. The trust documents Margaret had given me meant I had options, resources, the ability to leave without financial terror. Nathaniel tried to convince me to stay, alternating between apologies and anger, between promising to change and blaming me for humiliating him in front of his parents. His arguments didn't work anymore because I'd seen behind the curtain, understood that his warnings had been manipulation rather than reality, that the power he'd held over me had been built entirely on lies. The divorce was finalized in 6 months. I kept my portion of the trust because it had been designated for me personally, separate from marital assets, exactly as Catherine and Robert had intended. I bought a small house near the hospital using my trust distribution as a down payment, something I owned outright with no connection to anyone else's control or approval. I picked up the emergency shifts I'd been avoiding, rebuilt relationships with colleagues I distanced myself from when Nathaniel decided my work was less important than his family's social calendar. I had dinner with Catherine and Robert once a month, relationships we built independent of Nathaniel, based on genuine connection rather than obligatory family ties. They told me Nathaniel's portion of the trust had been restructured with significant conditions, including required family therapy and oversight of how he treated future partners. They said some lessons needed to come with consequences, and they weren't going to enable their son's cruelty with unconditional wealth. I still work in the cardiac unit at Yale New Haven. I still come home exhausted some nights after losing patients I wish I could have saved. But I don't apologize for my grief anymore. Don't minimize my work to make someone else comfortable. Don't sacrifice pieces of myself to meet standards designed to keep me powerless. The inheritance I'd spent 8 months believing I was losing had never been at risk, but the person I'd been becoming trying to earn it back was someone I barely recognized. Getting the truth in that attorney's office didn't just give me financial security. It gave me back my voice, my worth, my understanding that I'd never needed to prove I deserved respect from people who'd never stopped giving it. I sleep well now, not because I have money and a trust, but because I know exactly who I am, and I've never once apologized for it since.
You've just stepped into her revenge side, where every wound finds its justice, and every silence ends with truth. If her story struck a chord, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Another secret waits in the next video. See how her revenge begins.